Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for Turning History into Your Greatest Storyteller. I'm Chris Cummings of Pass It Down, and this is Laura Starr with History Associates Incorporated. So this is the first of what we hope is many webinars talking about how to be able to bring history and stories to life in more interactive and more engaging ways, but doing this from beginning to end, from I have an idea to how do I get started and what do I do, because we know how hard and how long that process can seem, but it doesn't have to be. So we will start I'll let Laura introduce herself, and then we'll get right into the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. So glad that you are here with us today. Especially excited to see some of History Associates friends and partners here, and just really excited to have this opportunity to meet those of you that I don't know yet. So as Chris mentioned, I am an archivist and historian with History Associates Incorporated. I've been a part of our team for close to 11 years now. Really started out working on archives projects, hands-on work. And then for the past 5 years or so, I've really been focused on helping to develop engagement strategies and plans for organizations to basically help acquire some archives and historical and digital storytelling support services. So I'm also responsible for managing our channel partnerships, and I'm so excited to be here with Chris and the Pass It Down folks. I'm also an avid cat mom. I always like to mention that, especially as maybe a little precursor to if one of the cats does crawl across the screen. I don't think that's going to happen. It's prime cat sleeping time here. But as you'll see from the picture that Chris just put up here on the screen, that is one of my most recent foster kittens named Galaxy. He recently went to his forever home, but I always like to use an open forum to mention that if you are in the Maryland area and looking to adopt a new kitty friend, let me know, because I can definitely hook you up through the rescue program. That's it for me for now. And as Chris said, just really excited to be here. And in a year, in 2020, when e-learning is really so important for all of us, and a way to keep connected while we're all virtual and in our different places, we just thought that now was the perfect time for this webinar. And so I'm just really excited. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Laura. And I'm Chris Cummings, founder and CEO of Pass It Down. We are a digital exhibit design platform that cultural organizations and brands all around the world use to be able to build cloud-based online and touchscreen exhibits. So best part about our work is being able to learn the stories of our clients and being able to see those stories come to life. And we're very lucky in that way. So let's dive right into the presentation today. And a couple of things to note, housekeeping things. At the bottom of the screen, you'll notice a couple of different capabilities here. So one is the ability to ask a question. So you can see the Ask a Question button. There's already been 3 questions asked. We're also going to be doing multiple polls through this presentation. Those polls will become available as we bring them up. And if you hit the poll button, you will see the poll question, have the ability to be able to answer it. So here we go.
Oh, Chris, before we get started, sorry, that one question there is whether or not the webinar is being recorded. Yes, it is being. Yep, it is being recorded, and for everybody that signed up, you will receive a link following the webinar with the link to that recording.
Perfect. So let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. There's no way around it. COVID-19 has had a huge impact on the cultural heritage industry. And this year has been hard on everyone, but it has been particularly hard industry-wise on cultural heritage. And we know that there's been impact in jobs and in budgets. And I think we're all fingers crossed hoping for a much better year in regards to 2021. But the problem with COVID has been that a lot of cultural heritage organizations took a wait and see approach. And the idea was, let's get through COVID. Let's just try to hit pause. Let's not change what we do or how we do it, and we'll come out on the other side. And unfortunately, that really hasn't worked that well. It's a bit of a deer in the headlights approach because COVID-19 is ramping up again. And as we've seen it ramp up again, we've unfortunately also seen museums and other cultural institutions and archives and libraries close again. And so the need to be able to go digital, to be able to take whatever your archive collection stories are and bring that online is greater now than it's ever been. And there are ways to be able to react and to be able to go online right now, even in the midst of a global pandemic. And so that's kind of what we're seeing within the industry. One of my favorite quotes is about how the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all. The world around us is changing. I'm not reading the quote exactly, but essentially the world around us is changing incredibly quickly. And so the only thing I can guarantee is if you don't react, if you just sit and pause and you don't take any attempts to change, it's not going to work. It will fail. So I think that, in this case, whatever your thoughts are on Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, pausing is only going, the world's never going to be the way it was before. And that's just the truth. What's also true is that cultural heritage is being forced to rethink how to engage their communities. And not only are they being forced to rethink that, but it's accelerated. The good thing is that this change actually started long before COVID-19, which means there's a lot of insights as to how to respond to the change the right way. So the world is changing, and it's largely due to smartphones. Starting in 2007, the ability to have a smartphone in everyone's hand really did change the way that people experience cultural heritage and experience archives and institutions. We like to joke in a haha, but it's kind of scary way that the Rembrandt on the wall is less exciting than the phone in people's hands. And this is probably a reality in some capacity for everyone's institution here. We know how addictive technology can be. And not only is the technology addictive and it changes the way we experience this, it's also changing the way that we want to interact with content and stories. And, one recent study found that attention spans have decreased over the last 10 years from 12 seconds to 8 seconds, meaning that the average human has an attention span shorter than a goldfish, which is sad but scary, but it also means we need to change the way that we engage our community, because technology has changed us and changed your audience and your community and your visitors. So our first question of the day in terms of talking about this change is about the need to be able to go digital. So if you click the poll, you'll see our first question is, does your organization have a digital storytelling program? Are you taking your stories, your collections, your archives, and are you putting those online, and are you telling stories with them in some capacity? So if you click the poll button, you'll have a chance to be able to vote yes or no here. We've already gotten about 50 votes. So here we go.
We should have had some music playing, Chris.
I would play Jeopardy music if possible as a tribute to Alex Trebek.
Yes, absolutely.
So click the mouse a couple of times. So typically when someone is looking to start a digital storytelling program, they want to be able to create an exhibit. They want to be able to bring their story to life. It starts with, I have an idea. I want to be able to interact with this content, be able to take our assets and put them online in some capacity. But the problem often becomes, how do I go from an idea to actually being able to launch it? And a lot of times it's so intimidating and it seems like it's so much work that people never get started at all. And so that's why we're here today. History Associates does a great job in being able to go from the early planning stages and being able to really lay out a plan and tactile steps to being able to say, this is the map forward to be able to do this. And then, our work is really on being able to just focus on how we make those stories come to life and make them super interactive. And there are a lot of ways you can do that today. So the question often is, where do you begin? You have your idea, but when you look at getting to a launch, it seems like you're at the bottom of a mountain. And the question is, how do you get to the top and actually bring this to life? But here's the good thing. Getting started, taking action doesn't actually have to be like climbing a mountain. It's not as hard as it seems. It's not as long a process as it seems. And there is an easy path forward. And so we'll be able to go through those steps today. So Laura's going to do a great job in walking through how to be able to take your vision for whatever your story is, whatever your organization's stories are, to be able to bring that to life. And with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over and to Laura. And if you have any questions at all in the meantime, put them in the Ask a Question. By the way, at the end of this presentation, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Chris. Just screen sharing here.
You got it. And your screen is now being cast to everyone.
Perfect. Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, so as Chris mentioned, what I'm here to kind of share with you all today is really some nuts and bolts around how you take physical, historical assets and really digitally transform them to turn them into compelling storytelling content. So that begins with an action plan. As Chris mentioned, we're here to offer advice on how to make this process easier, how to kind of take it step by step, and really make an achievable plan that can be implemented. And we're going to talk about lots of implementation strategies too. So beginning then with an action plan. Oops, too fast. All right, great. So the first thing, Chris talked about how so many people have a vision or a goal for a project, for a storytelling program. What I find really helpful at the very beginning is when you're thinking about creating an action plan, identify those strategic objectives that you really want to achieve. So I took a look at our attendee list prior to starting the event today to kind of see where folks are coming from, what organizations you're a part of, what roles you have. And we have really a diverse group of folks here. So I just wanted to, as we're talking about identifying goals, I just wanted to offer some suggestions on some questions that you might ask yourself as you go to try and identify goals. And I've kind of identified these by different groups of folks that are here today. So if you're an archivist like myself, or a librarian or a curator, somebody that has a stewardship responsibility for collections, think about how you want to provide access to your collections through a digital storytelling campaign. This is really an opportunity to bring collections to light. So are there underrepresented communities or stories documented in your archive that you really want to highlight? So for folks that are archivists, librarians, thinking about digital storytelling as a way to connect community to collections is kind of a great way to start thinking about what those goals might be. If you're a marketing professional, you're always thinking about how to connect audiences with your brand, right? So think of digital storytelling perhaps as a way to increase audience engagement or market engagement through unique historical content. It'll really kind of make your brand stand out. If you're an educator, and I know there's many folks from education today with us, what learning objectives do you really wish to achieve through digital storytelling? What stories do you think students will most connect with? And so for you, think about digital storytelling as a way to use historical content to supplement and enhance curriculum. And then finally, for those of you who are executives and directors of your organizations, what will your core supporters most connect with? Is there something new that you can share with your longtime stakeholders to really get them excited? And is there content that you can utilize to connect with a new base of constituents? So consider digital storytelling as a way to really propel your fundraising campaigns forward and to just really make those campaigns stand out to your stakeholders. So those are just some things, some thoughts to ponder as you're identifying goals to include in your action plan. So as we all know, laying out a series of small baby steps will lead to bigger success ultimately for your project. We know this from life experience, right? But these steps, I really recommend that these steps be tied specifically to your calendar so you have firm deadlines and goals associated with each one. Having the baby steps will help you not get overwhelmed as easily, kind of keeps some focus on that next milestone. And we all know that satisfaction that comes with crossing something off our to-do list, right? So if you've got these baby steps with goals and timelines, you can check those off pretty frequently. Also, you're going to be able to demonstrate, excuse me, accomplishments as well as course correct sooner if you're kind of doing these frequent check-ins on how you're accomplishing your baby steps along the way. In thinking about the baby steps and achieving those, it's really important to consider the resources that are required and to document these in an action plan. So, there's a couple different types of resources, right? We think about people. So does your in-house team have the skills to accomplish the plan that you're putting in place for digital storytelling? If they have the skills, do they have the bandwidth to do it? Or, maybe you need some external help on that's a temporary or a longer term basis. Consider certainly volunteers and interns and folks in your community who might be willing to help out with some of these steps. Or also, of course, think about whether or not some outside consultants are needed who are really able to focus on the tasks at hand and provide the expertise in implementing digital storytelling campaigns. I also wanted to just mention everybody, from my experience, it's sometimes a bit of a slog to think about the labor hours that are required to implement your action plan. It's really important, though, to try and estimate those in order to identify what staffing requirements there are and what resource requirements there are in terms of people. Beyond people, when we're talking about resources, think about the technology you're going to need. We're going to go into more detail in a bit about digitization and digital software technology. But now, while you're formulating your action plan, it's really time to assess what hardware and software you might have already to tell digital stories. Once you've assessed your resource requirements, where there might be gaps in people and technology, you'll be able to really estimate the costs that are required to do this. Just a little tip here, I certainly like to recommend sort of a classic negotiation technique when you're building budgets into your action plans. Aim a little high in order to have some space to kind of pull back a little bit if needed, so to not get backed into a corner. And who knows, maybe, the full budget request will get approved and you'll have an outstanding program. All right, and then finally, in creating an action plan, be sure to establish measures of success. Digital storytelling lends itself really, really well to gathering engagement metrics. So set some goals here that will exhibit whether or not the campaign is working. So for example, set a goal for the number of visitors you're hoping to drive to your new exhibit landing page if that ends up being the output of your digital storytelling. You might also consider setting a target number of new followers to your social media accounts. And these could all be considered markers of success for a digital storytelling campaign. When setting benchmarks, do build in some flexibility in cases of unforeseen circumstances. We all can certainly relate to this given COVID. COVID has made it impossible for many folks to actually access their physical archives and their collections. So think about then, in that case, what outside sources you might use to tell the story. And we're going to talk about some of those ideas for outside sources in a bit. You may not be able to tell the original story you intended to tell with not having access to these physical assets. However, what's important is that you're still reaching that objective of engaging with your audiences. It might just be in a way that you didn't necessarily anticipate, and that's okay. I think we've all learned that we have to be flexible. We can't predict what's going to happen all the time. At least I've learned that this year. And so just trying to keep the ultimate engagement and goal in mind will really help put this into context. Okay, so fair warning. I've been watching a lot of Food Network shows at our house since the pandemic started, so bear with me on this one. All right, so like your favorite chefs on the Food Network, I've sprinkled in some pro tips throughout the presentation today. So the action plan that we just talked about, that's really going to serve as your recipe for success for your project. You can use the action plan to share those key ingredients, your strategic vision, the goals we outlined, the tactical steps, the resources, the budgets that you need, and be able to take that to your stakeholders. So this action plan ensures that you're well prepped to request what you need, and voila, Then you have a plan where you can present it. You can get support from your director, your board, your donors, whoever your stakeholders might be. All right, so that's my segment on developing an action plan. Now we're going to talk about really the transformation process, transforming physical historical assets into vivid stories. And of course, a critical technical step in that is digitization, is the scanning work itself. You have to get all that cool historical stuff into digital form to use it for engaging digital storytelling. I could devote an entire webinar series to digitization. So I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to be quickly going through some tips for successful digitization. Before I do that, though, we're going to use one of our polls here. Let's see, Chris, can you activate that second poll?
So the second poll is going live now. If you click the poll button, you should see the second question now appear on what does your digitization program look like?
Perfect, great. Yeah, so this is just, we wanted to just do a check-in with everyone to see what digitization looks like in your organization. Maybe you haven't digitized before. Maybe you're digitizing in response to user requests. This is what we think of as like ad hoc digitization, digitization on demand. Maybe you're sometimes digitizing to create content for special events, for your marketing teams, for your event teams. Or maybe you already have a robust digitization program in place where you're routinely producing new digital content. I know that a lot of organizations have implemented digitization projects as we're looking to transform physical records into digital records, especially as many of us have gone remote. All right. Great. So I'm just looking here at our live results, and it looks like the majority of folks are digitizing in response to user requests, so doing that on-demand digitization. And then our next percentage, 30% there, have a robust digitization program in place already, which is awesome. That is great. And so hopefully there's some new knowledge here for everybody that I'm going to share. So thanks so much for taking the poll. All right, so, oops, lost my mouse here. Too fast again. All right. So no matter where you are with digitization, I just wanted to emphasize 3 main principles when you're digitizing. The first is that digitization should be achievable. Consider developing a mini action plan. That's my keyword here for the day is action plan. But think about developing an action plan specific to your digitization program. Take that baby step approach again. The second principle is to be consistent in your digitization to make sure that you're getting the same quality of output every time, that your digital content is standardized. That will just make a lot of things easier down the road. And then make sure that you're digitizing in a way that's technologically responsive to your organization. Again, thinking about what technology you already have in-house that might be able to help with the digitization work. And also consider the technology infrastructure you have in place to handle the digital content that's going to be created. Can your system handle high resolution images, for example, or is it going to totally overwhelm your digital repository, in which case you may need to think about doing lower quality access scanning. We're going to talk about preservation and storage in a little more detail in a few moments, but these are just the 3 key principles I wanted to mention for digitization. A few more tips here for successful scanning. Be picky. More than likely, you simply can't digitize everything. Select items that are the most valuable, or for the cases of digital storytelling that we're talking about today, what content is going to be most engaging, and digitize that first. You can always digitize additional materials in future projects. I previously mentioned the importance of consistency. Consistency is also key in defining specifications that you're going to use for scanning and managing digital content. This is that nuts and bolts stuff I talked about, right? Like thinking about, what image resolution, color specifications you're going to use per format type. We recommend using well-accepted standards whenever possible, like the Federal Agency Digitization Guidelines Initiative, that's FAGI standards. Those of you in government or cultural heritage organizations probably know FAGI quite well. It just helps as like reference points in the community for this digitization work to make sure your specifications are on target, and that you're going to be able to have consistent quality of output. Also, I just wanted to mention, set a standard for how you're naming your files that you're scanning. Be consistent with that. File naming conventions go a long way when you're trying to find something, either through search or through browse of the systems where your digital content ends up landing. I mentioned this briefly already, but select technology that fits your organization. It may be possible that you can digitize with some scanners you already have. If it's a small scale project that you're getting started with, certainly, out of the box scanning software and hardware can definitely work. If you're going to achieve a larger digitization project, with a lot of items to scan, or maybe there's special formats, audiovisual legacy formats come to mind, you may need to get some outside help from a digitization vendor. And that's certainly an option as well. Again, keeping those overall goals and use cases in mind when you're choosing the scanning technology is really important.
Hey, Laura, let me interrupt real quick to say we're having some really good questions and conversations occurring in the chat and in the question bar. Just want everyone to know we'll get to these questions at the end of the presentation in the Q&A. So just know that we hear you and continue to ask questions because some of them are great and super relevant to what Laura is discussing.
Great, perfect. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you keeping an eye on that. All right, yeah. So one more tip. I'm sorry, my voice is going here. It's really important to create good metadata for your digitized content. That's essential. That digital files and what you're creating in digitization is really only as good as the metadata that accompanies them. There's various types of metadata. Again, I'm not going to go into detail here. We can certainly talk about it more. But I do want to just mention that metadata creation can certainly be an iterative process. Excuse me. There's many projects that I've worked on where we do an initial inventory of historical assets, right? We do that at the beginning, and then as the project progresses, kind of add more enhanced description of those assets as the project goes. Also a lot of organizations will add metadata once the content is already scanned, especially if it's being managed in a system, to actually enter that metadata through the system. There are a number of automated metadata extraction tools that you may be familiar with as well, that can expedite the process of creating metadata. I do want to just say, if you're using an automated metadata extraction tool, please keep in mind that these systems will need some upfront training to make sure they're responsive, and also that they'll need careful quality control by a human once the tool has been run. Metadata can be a little tricky, but again, it's just really essential that you're creating a metadata schema that works for your organization, is responsive to your assets, and by having that, you're going to just ensure that your content is really well documented and in good shape. This is my last point about scanning. Success factor here. Once digitized, it's essential to ensure safe storage, preservation, safeguarding of your digital files. This is really important, of course, again, for folks that are in cultural heritage, have that stewardship responsibility to preserve that content. But really, preserving the content that you've created through the scanning process is really important for everybody. It's basically about protecting your digital investment, right? There's no point in investing resources into the digitization process without having a plan for how it's going to be managed and preserved once you have your digital content. So we guide a lot of organizations in planning for digital preservation. There's a number of standards, again, that I won't go into here, but just think about, this whole digital transformation process that I've just talked about. All of this is scalable to the resources and the needs of your organization. Backing up your files that are created through scanning to a cloud-based storage system like Amazon S3 or Glacier, that'll work for many organizations, and many of you, your IT teams, are probably doing this. For archives, library, and museum organizations, it might be best to consider a digital preservation system to ensure longevity and perpetual access to your cultural heritage content. So again, scalable. We can, that action plan will lay all of this out. All right, so my next pro tip is not coming from the kitchen, but from the football field. I'm a big Ravens fan, and I won't talk about any of what's gone on with that team this year. Don't know what happened, but never mind. So my tip here is to create a digitization playbook that documents all of the guidelines and the standards that we just discussed. The playbook is going to provide the rules to your own team. It's going to provide the standards. It's going to lay out the tactics for scanning in case as well if you're involving any outside personnel, special teams that might be helping to achieve digitization. And this playbook is going to ensure that your scanning program meets the 3 core principles we talked about at the beginning, that it's achievable, that it's consistent, and that it's technologically responsive. Okay, I think we are here at poll 3 now, Chris. And this one is, so we just talked about scanning, we talked about the technical stuff. Now we're going to get back again into content. And so our question here is about whether or not your archive provides everything to tell your story. We live on that? Perfect. Let's get over there. All right, so does your archive provide everything needed to tell your story? So we've got 4 options here. Yes, our archive covers every piece of our history, which would be, let me just say, that would be amazing. Or there are a few gaps in our archives related to telling our story. There might be substantial gaps. That's the 3rd choice there, that there's substantial gaps that's pretty much making it impossible to tell a complete story by only using material in your archive. Or maybe you don't have an in-house archive, and that's certainly fine. We've worked with a number of organizations that do not have what they consider an archive in-house. So appreciate the responses we're getting here. And the majority of folks are answering with number 2 there, that yes, there are some gaps in our archive. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in the next segment, is how to supplement your existing archive, or to totally kind of look beyond what you might have in-house. Or if you don't have an in-house archive, certainly these are going to be useful tips for you as well. So let's look at a few tips here for just kind of looking outside your walls for historical content for storytelling. So if you have an in-house archive, you might need some help in learning about whether or not you need to look for external content. My suggestion here in analyzing your own archive is to create a wireframe for the story that you want to tell, and then simply evaluate your content against that wireframe to recognize gaps in your storyline. So that's the first thing, is just to understand what that story is you want to share, and to evaluate the gaps. Those gaps can then be filled in with historical research. This is actually an area where many of my colleagues spend a lot of time doing digital and in-person research to help create complete historical stories. That might mean going to a local historical society or government archive, and certainly in today's environment, relying on digital sources that are available in databases and other platforms. And the point here is to try and find nuggets of information and compelling imagery to support the storytelling that you're trying to do. So fill in with outside resources. The last pro tip I have is coming from the courtroom, which Chris is somewhat familiar with from previous lifetimes. So we're talking about external content, right?
That also sounds bad, but I get it.
Sorry. Chris has a legal background. So when you turn to external sources for storytelling content, please be sure to follow rights acquisition and licensing protocols. It's really vital to know the ins and outs of copyright clearance before publishing anything outside publicly, any outside content publicly. It's also really helpful to manage this licensed content and its metadata in a digital asset management system of some sort. This will help you know what content you have and when your purchased rights expire. So you're going to want to be able to reuse your content with confidence, that confidence that you're in compliance with copyright requirements and other licensing considerations. So I always feel like I have to kind of put that that tip in here, and it's just a really important one to make sure that you have the rights to the content that you would like to use. So I'm going to conclude my segment here just by spending a few moments on the topic of crowdsourcing history and archives. I really, truly believe that every single person can be a historian, an archivist, a storyteller. This idea is not new. It actually comes right out of the field of public history. Public history is about, engaging with history, engaging people with history at museums, in communities, through performances, living history programs, that type of thing. For those of us that are trained archivists and historians, we know the importance of the rigor and the technique that we've learned through schooling, that we've gained through our experiences, and that our contributions are vital to the historical field. But the majority of people usually engage with history and the past in really personal ways. We do this by listening to family stories, by conducting family genealogy research, looking at photo albums, reading historical fiction, which is my favorite genre of reading, going to the museums with our family, right? This is very personal. And when we're talking about historical storytelling for your organization, you don't need an advanced history degree to capture and share stories. So I'd like to just review right now 3 ways that story programs can contribute to your archive. So this is the idea of actually creating content that is going to become part of your archive through storytelling projects. The first I'd like to mention here is oral history. Oral history interviews are one of the absolute best ways to capture organizational memories of folks. It can be rich sources of text, of audio, of video content. And, we all know that there's nothing quite like hearing someone's firsthand account to really have an impact. Oral histories can certainly be produced with full-scale production teams. Organizations do this, especially if they're looking to do a documentary, for example. But, given our current circumstances, oral histories can also be captured through video conferencing platforms. They won't be, superior quality like if you had a full production team. But the whole point here is to capture those memories and those stories before they're gone. That's really the point, and so important. The second form of content that I just wanted to mention is web content. Web archiving is a really hot topic in the archives field. It focuses on harvesting dynamic web content to capture it and to preserve it for future engagement and for historical purposes. We all know how ephemeral web content can be, but of course it's a vital information source about organizations and their audiences, their clients, and how they're engaging to do their missions. There are many tools and platforms out there for web harvesting. And once again, I just would recommend surveying what those options are and just aligning them with the needs and resources of the organization, but doing something to grab some of that content to bring it into your corporate or organizational archive. And then finally, when you curate a digital exhibit, you're creating new content for your archive. A digital exhibit can live well beyond the time that you've made it public or that you've stood it up for your internal audiences within your organization. When people of the future, folks that are doing historical research in the future, look at your archive, a digital exhibit and the content that was presented there is really going to be a snapshot of how your organization shared its historical stories in 2020. So with that now, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, and Chris is going to talk about online engagement with digital historical assets.
Laura, thank you so much. And I mean, you made so many amazing points that I agree with. I'm sure most people here agree with as well. And I'll try to bring up a few of those in my presentation, how this world all connects together. So let me share my screen real quick. And here we go. So I want to talk a little bit about, once you've gone through, I have an idea, you've put it together a action plan, you've then taken the steps to be able to digitize some of those assets, to be able to pull all of that content together. The question is, how do you then package all of those assets together into a engaging digital experience, with the ultimate goal being engagement and impact? You know, some of the questions here were along the lines of, well, how do you determine what is the most important, right? And we'll get into that because there are ways, and I know there will be disagreements within the organization, but there is a path to being able to prove whether or not something is or is not the most engaging, and being able to test that. So whenever you're creating a digital storytelling experience, I think it's important to focus on a goal. And the goal that we always share with the organizations we work with that they tend to all subscribe to is, your goal should be to always create an amazing experience that your audience will never forget, and you'll want the experience to be so memorable they'll want to tell somebody about it. And if you can put that as the lens as to what you're trying to do, it helps you to figure out, well, where should we start? Because as someone mentioned, they have millions and millions of assets, right, that they've gone through. And that is fantastic, and that's great. But the question is, if somebody had to remember your organization's collections for one experience and one story, what would be the one you want to share? What is the most memorable thing you want to share? Because if you can inspire somebody and tell them a story that they remember and create an experience they'll remember, they will come back to you and explore everything that you do going forward. But I really want to hone in on being able to focus and being able to look at your collections and your assets and figure out, what are the most important stories that we want to tell? So let's talk a little bit about storytelling and why I think that great digital exhibits and great online exhibits focus on storytelling. Great digital storytelling experiences are the ones that are able to take your assets and to pull the narratives out of them. So what most organizations, what most cultural heritage organizations, libraries, museums, universities do, is they will put together and put online a repository of every asset they have. And that is great. And that is needed, and that is perfect. But having a repository is not the same thing as being able to tie the different assets together into what stories they can produce. And so the question is, what is the context that you can create from your assets, and being able to bring that to life through a particular story? That's what we're talking about here today. So this is a photo of Jackie Robinson. Now, this photo existed in the Chattanooga Public Library's collections, and it was one of several photos. And what was interesting, though, is that the Chattanooga Public Library would show this photo, not Jackie Robinson, Jackie Mitchell. They would show this photo to students in the area and in the schools, and they would say, do you have any idea what the story is or what this is about? And they would say no. But what if instead I told you that this is the girl who struck out Babe Ruth? And we're going to tell you that in 1921, 4,000 people walked into a rainy stadium to see her strike out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig in one inning, and to be the only woman to ever be able to do so and to say that. Is that something you're going to forget? No. So the question is, how do we take 10, 20, 30 photos that have metadata and are placed into a preservation system and be able to pull that together to create something that's memorable in a digital storytelling experience? So here's why storytelling is so important. And this is why we want you to focus on storytelling. There has been an extensive amount of research. I saw someone here said hello from Stanford. And a lot of this research came from Stanford about the impact of storytelling and studies of what happens to someone's brain when they hear a story. And what those studies have found is that stories are remembered 22 times more than facts. 22 times more. And so if you're trying to create a memorable experience, focusing on storytelling is not just a good idea, it's actually proven to have a better impact when it comes to people remembering the experiences that you're sharing. The reason why, by the way, is that when we hear a story, the brain lights up like a Christmas tree. It triggers all different aspects of the brain and our senses in the brain. And it actually releases chemicals in our brain, like dopamine, cortisol, endorphins, and oxytocin. These are things, by the way, like considered the love chemical. And so when we hear stories, we all lean in, we all remember. Part of the reason scientists believe this is true, by the way, is that we told stories before we could write. And we told stories literally to survive. And so the theory is that our ability to hear and be impacted by a story is literally hardwired into our DNA because it is the essence of human survival. And so if you can always remember that storytelling has an incredible way to make an impact on your community and figure out how can we take our assets and turn them into stories, you're going to stand out and you're going to make a huge impact on your community. So part of the reason why the brain lights up like a Christmas tree is that when we hear stories, it triggers senses. If we talk about a rainy day, we can imagine the sound of rain. We can imagine what it feels like, what it looks like. And so if you're able to tell stories in multimedia, video, audio, text, photo, they help trigger different emotions and different senses in the brain to help us remember these experiences. So when Laura was talking about bringing your story to life, but what gaps you might have, a gap might be, well, we have a lot of photos, but we don't have any written text talking about the story that connects all these photos together. Or we have a great photo collection, but we have no video. And in a world in which everything is so digital, and in a world in which video consumption is going up, a gap may be we need to create multimedia content that doesn't exist to be able to engage our audience. So one question I would encourage all of you to think is when you think of your collections that you hold on to, you know more about those collections than anyone else in the world. You are the bearer of that knowledge. You are the holder of that knowledge. And if you were to think through all of those collections, what 5 stories in those collections would you want people to remember? What 5 stories? And then when you think of those 5 stories, the question is, are you effectively telling those stories today? Does your community know the stories the way that you do? And if they don't, there's an opportunity to say, let's start with just 5 stories. Just 5 stories that we want to get across that convey why our collections are so important. And then I would narrow down even more to say, if your collection needed to be remembered for telling 1 story, what would that story be? So let's now get into, you've got your assets digitized. You want to be able to bring them to life. You now have to choose a medium to be able to bring those stories to life. And there are a number of different mediums at your fingertips. You could create an online exhibit. You could create a touchscreen exhibit. You could tell a story through a social media campaign. AR and VR is beginning to really grow in popularity. And in a world in which we've all been stuck in our homes, it's one in which it really has been able to prove a valuable use case. There's even been great work from some public libraries that created escape rooms from different literature and gamify the experience of telling stories. So there's a lot of different tool sets that are at your fingertips. But there are rules in which every digital storytelling experience should follow, and I would encourage everyone to think about. When you're getting ready to be able to bring your assets to life, you want to make sure that however you do it, you're doing it in a way in which it is accessible and compliant. And that would be ADA and WCAG 2.1 compliant. And this should be the first thing you think of. Accessibility shouldn't be a band-aid when it comes to digital storytelling and it comes to your collections. It should be first on the list, because if you're going to bring your stories to life, it needs to be brought to life for everyone, every time. 2, whatever you do, you want to make sure it's responsibly designed. I'm sure we have all seen online collection systems or online experiences that look good on your computer, but you load them on your phone and it's almost impossible to use and it's difficult to use. Every single day, mobile consumption increases. And so however you bring your story to life, you want to make sure it will work on a phone, a tablet, a computer, and a touchscreen. And you also want to make sure when we say bringing it to life on a phone that you're following best practices. There are still so many exhibits that are powered by Flash. And Flash doesn't work on most devices anymore, and it will not work in the next 2 years. So really be thinking about where technology is going and make sure your solutions scale to meet every device. The third component is you want to make sure that your experience is interactive because, again, we're all addicted to our phones. You got to find a way to be able to capture our attention. And so making it more interactive and engaging is going to lead to a better experience. And the second component is you want it to be cloud-based. And the reason why cloud-based is so important is that people get bored very, very easily. And so if you're running a cloud-based storytelling solution, you can update and rotate whatever story you're featuring with the push of a button. And that's important because people always want something new to look at. And so, I would encourage you to look at when you're bringing your stories to life, doing it in a way that's flexible and aware of being able to constantly showcase new content based around what people are thinking of. So for example, if you look at the calendar, you should, if it's Women's History Month, you should be able to take your women's history collection and feature it that month. If it's 4th of July or a holiday, you should be able to look at your collections and say, do we have anything from that holiday coming up that we can highlight? And if you do that, you're going to have more engagement and more interaction because you're tying what people are thinking about to what they're doing. A lot of the questions earlier were about how do we know whether something is or isn't working well? And the best way to know is through analytics and through the data. If you can look at your online exhibits that you're putting out into the world and measure those exhibits, you can figure out what content in our collections is the most engaging and what's not. And that data should help to let you know and be able to provide accountability for what digital storytelling exhibits and experiences you can create in the future that people, your audience, wants to learn more about. Data should ultimately lead the way. And that's something that's just really starting to be incorporated into the cultural heritage industry and collections, but it's really important to know. And then finally, Laura talked a lot about crowdsourcing, the importance of crowdsourcing. And I think the ability to create participatory experiences is really, really important. And it's important for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons it's so important is that a true history, a true story, contains a diversity of viewpoints. And being able to offer your audience to be a participant will create a richer history. The other thing that's so important is that for a lot of our collections, they're not diverse. With one of the cities we work with, the city is 33% African American, but the city's collections were over 99% Caucasian. That is a huge, huge problem. And there's a huge gap that exists between the demographics and the collections. And this is true of almost everywhere in the US. Crowdsourcing can't fix this problem overnight, but you can start to chip away at it. So thank you so much for everyone. We're going to transition back now to the Q&A section and be able to answer some of the questions that have been posed today. I can't tell, Laura, is my screen still being shared here?
No, I just see us.
Awesome. All right, so let me look at the questions for us, and we'll go ahead and get started with our first question. So one question we have is, how do you create historical storytelling campaigns for new organizations that may not have a long history? And I think it's a great question because I think there's a sense from some organizations of, well, what if we're only 10 or 20 years old, right? Where do we start? Do we have a history to tell, or do we have to wait?
Yeah, I can respond to that, Chris, in that, we've helped organizations who literally have been, in existence like 1 or 2 years, startup organizations. And what we really think about in that scenario, what we advise is to really put the organization into a historical context, into a historical framework. So it's kind of about focusing on sort of how this new company is an innovation, is an evolution in their industry. And you know, my favorite my favorite project that I've worked on so far at HAI was actually in creating the history of shopping for the online rental company Gwenny B. And that was just so much fun. We created a historical narrative that looked at how shopping has evolved, starting from like basically homespun. You know, we started with homespun that was done in your homes, then taking sort of pre-measured, pre-packaged, off-the-shelf clothing to the country store, up through the department store experience in the 50s. We talked about the sort of mall rats of the 80s and 90s. We got to the point where, okay, the first online purchase was made. It was a Sting CD, by the way, of all the things. And then, you know, from that one online purchase, that first online purchase, the explosion of e-commerce with the proliferation of the internet, explosion of e-commerce, and how that all sort of led up to innovation then in e-commerce and sort of this customized, totally online rental experience for clothing that Gwenny B and many others were doing. And, you know, we had this really lengthy narrative, but what was so cool is that then Gwenny B turned that narrative into an 8-minute Facebook documentary. And so I actually kind of got to be like the lead historian on the history of shopping, and did the documentary alongside some former models and fashion designers. And then they took it and did a press release event of that, a public release event. We had some stand-up exhibit panels that I kind of walked guests through to talk about the history of shopping. So that's all just an example, right? An example of how you can utilize kind of a modern moment in time, put it into a historical context, and engage through a number of both online and in-person events. And if everybody will indulge me, I'll include the link to the Facebook documentary that I mentioned. Anybody that loves to shop, this is for you.
Everybody, I know we're coming up on the hour. We're going to keep going and answering questions for anyone that wants to stick around. But for anyone that needs to run, a couple of things we want you to know. One is that this webinar and presentation has been recorded, and we will be emailing this presentation to everyone that has signed up for this webinar today. Two is that Pass It Down in History Associates is working on a digital storytelling playbook that is a turnkey playbook from I have an idea to I want to be able to build a interactive storytelling exhibit with that idea. So how to every step along the way. So everyone that has participated today will have a chance to be able to receive that playbook for free from our organizations. And then we will also, for any organization that's interested, be holding a free 30-minute consultation jointly between History Associates and Pass It Down on being able to look at your digital storytelling or ideas to be able to help you figure out how to bring those to life. And I'll put that call to action live now under that green button. So let's get to our next question we have. This is a question from Bill, and I think it's a good question. It's about action plans. How do you estimate work time when you don't know how much time will be needed?
Yeah, this one, that's an excellent question, Bill, and a really, really tough one, to be honest. What I would recommend is relying and reaching out to your professional community. I'm not sure what type of organization you're a part of, but certainly to see if anyone else has done projects like what you have in mind. You know, I found, especially in the archives and the archives community in particular, everyone is really willing to help each other in planning these types of projects. The other thing is that, you know, History Associates, one of the things that we do is help with this level of effort estimate. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, Chris just mentioned the button here to request the consulting session. We're happy to talk to you, at no charge, and try and just develop some framework and some estimated resource requirements for your project.
Absolutely. So let's see. I think we have another great question from Lena, which is, do you have any recommendations for small organizations where the bandwidth to create news story content isn't always available?
Ooh, I might actually look to you, Chris, what your thoughts are on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big part of what we've discussed today is that a lot of times, trying to get to the launch of an exhibit can seem intimidating, and it's because often you're trying to build you're trying to imagine taking your entire collection and getting it online 100% with every story, every piece of content at once. And so it's breaking it down into those baby steps that I think you talked about earlier, Laura, and saying, that may be what we can do in the next 2 years, but what can we do in the next 90 days? And what is achievable with the resources we have in the next 90 days? So if you start small and you say, well, what are the 5 stories we want to start with? And you just get those 5 stories online and you do so in an engaging way, it becomes easier to be able to tack onto that versus trying to do everything all at once.
Great. Just looking here, some of those other questions we've got rolling in.
Sure. So there is a question. So to be clear, I am a former federal attorney, and there is a question about, can you address copyright for online publishing images? There is a lot by Kira. There is a lot of information online. I will sound very lawyerly in saying that every state has different rules and different interpretations in regards to copyright. But one thing I can promise you is you want to be thinking about copyright whenever you're putting images online, and you want to do and make sure that you are associating the correct metadata, the caption, the author, the source for whatever image. And then the second part of it is you need a way for people to be able to make a claim that that image actually should not be published. And that there's a problem with that image. And then, if they make that complaint, you do have an obligation to investigate that and to act. And so sometimes organizations make a mistake because they put the images up, they do the best with the metadata they have, but they don't actually have a channel for their audience to make a claim or report about a photo. And that's something you got to do. All right,
yeah,
Laura,
absolutely.
What question do we have next?
So I see one here from, I think it's from Kathy. She said that she works for a private corporation who is really interested in keeping most of their history private. And so she'd like to hear ideas on options for digital engagement that could be targeted specifically in-house.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of solutions that are available. A big part of this is in being able to use a platform that can have both a public-facing experience, but also a private-facing experience. If you are looking for it to be private, oftentimes if you're talking about a corporate archive, you're going to have information that is really just meant for your employees, and it's meant to be kept in-house, and you're going to want it to be connected to either an intranet and follow your IT security protocols. This is one of the things that Pass It Down does for multiple big brands all around the world, but there are other ways to do it. But the big thing is just, is it secure? Does it play nicely with whatever system that your company uses? And is it easy to use? And if you keep those 3 things in mind, you'll have success. And you'll often want this to be behind some type of a firewall, passcode, or password, 2-factor authentication, all kinds of things like that.
And I'll just add there. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris. I'll just add to that. For organizations that are looking to create internal storytelling campaigns, I think there's a lot of ways to share that information, to promote it, basically, right? Like if that's through internal social media or engagement, like Slack channels, you know, doing some type of internal celebration. Like we've seen a lot of organizations who will create like little contests or social media campaigns around like their historical assets, and like, hey, does anybody know what this is? And just those different kinds of, so not talking necessarily about the technology to do that, as you just did so well, but talking about kind of the principles and the campaigns that might be possible.
Absolutely. And I think also, you know, in private systems do a good job of trying to transfer corporate knowledge. You know, every time an employee retires and is going to, you know, leave an organization, if they've been there 10, 20, 30 years, they have an incredible amount of knowledge and stories about the culture of that organization. And so private systems, when done the right way, do a very good job of protecting that culture so that it's not lost and that it can become something that every employee can experience. And it helps to keep what makes that organization special. There are a couple of questions we have here are we aware of any grant programs for individuals who are looking to preserve and digitize an archive? There are so many this is such a this question in and of itself could have hours and hours dedicated to it. Or I'll tee it up for you though if you had to give a quick answer here.
Yeah, well, my response to what you just said, Chris, is that perhaps this is our next webinar. You know, there are just so many grant options out there for both small organizations as well. You know, I will say that grant programs for individuals are I would not say as prolific as the ones for small institutions. But, you know, certainly through partnerships with some of your local repositories or institutions might be a way to get access to those small institutional grants. That's just a suggestion, and we often are able to connect individuals with repositories that would be interested in helping you get the resources for that collections care.
Absolutely. And we've got a great question from Genevieve on, when we say storytelling, are you talking about several different kinds of formats, blog posts, online exhibits, story maps, or do we have a more specific format in mind? And I think when we're talking about storytelling, we're first talking about, in essence, what is the story you want to share? The way that you share it, that medium can change, and you can tell the same story in a variety of different mediums. And it could be on a blog post, it could be an online exhibit, it could be through a map. But the first point is getting down what is the story and why is that story important, and then figuring out the proper medium to be able to share it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing too, Chris, the question about what if there's a disagreement about what's engaging for an institution. I'm sure that you have encountered that frequently, and you're a really good peacekeeper. So I'm curious to see what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, let's be frank. If we're talking about a museum, you know, we know that there's typically going to be tension and disagreement between the staff of the museum and the board. This is true of almost every museum and a lot of other cultural institutions. And so there are two things I would say. One, there are some stories that are so important to the organization, they have to be told. And you'll know what those are, right? Your gut will tell you that these are, you know, why our organization exists. But this also goes back to what I was talking about earlier when it comes to data and analytics and being able to measure. So when someone goes, what is or isn't the most engaging and what should we do? I would encourage you to say, well, the best way to find out is let's build 2 or 3 different exhibits, and then let's figure out which one people tend to gravitate towards. What do they spend more time on? What gets more views? What has more time spent on the page? Data and analytics will tell you everything that can either verify your gut and your team's gut, or it's going to surprise you. It's going to shock you. But I can assure you that if you focus on the data and you measure and you make measurement a part of your normal activity, you will build a more engaging, more interactive collection, and you'll start to build a really big community from doing that, because you'll get better every single day. If you don't measure, you're guessing.
Yeah, I think those are really, really great points. It's always about demonstrating ROI, right?
It is, and I think, demonstrating ROI is important, and I know that that in and of itself can be intimidating, right? Uh, because it can seem counter to the mission of the organization, which is just we shouldn't have to prove it or measure what it does or doesn't work. It's just this is important. But if you can show to your organization, your boss, to whoever you answer to, that you are measuring what is and isn't working, they're going to value that work way more than before. We also have a great question from Kira about what is the best way to advertise your digital projects. So, Laura, I'm sure you and I both have a lot of experience and a variety of viewpoints here. What would you say from history associates and from your experience?
My first response is social media. Social media lends itself so well to promoting other digital content, whether it's a digital exhibit or some type of other online content. That immediately comes to mind. As I mentioned, some sort of creative campaigns too. Everybody loves short snippet videos, like little promo videos of the digital projects. So those are the things that kind of immediately spring to mind if you're trying to advertise externally. I assume that's what the question's about, is that external promotion and advertising. Chris, what do you think?
I think one, planning ahead of time, right? Like I see a lot of cultural institutions put a lot of work into building a digital project, and then they go, okay, we got to advertise it. Advertising should begin at it should be something you're thinking of months in advance. So one, spend a lot of time planning it. And by planning it, think about who are organizations that have an interest in this digital project, and can we reach out and partner with them to help promote it and collaborate on it? So I think partnership is a big deal. I think building good relationships with local media partners to be able to promote a new project when it comes out ahead of time is really important. And we've seen organizations have incredible success in doing that. Tying your digital project launch to the calendar is going to also have effects. So earlier when I talked about if it's Women's History Month, being able to pull from your collections and showcase stories around women's history. Same thing, if you've got a digital project, you may decide that the launch date should tie to something on the calendar that connects with that digital project, and you can build to that. And that way, it is going to have more engagement and have more success from a marketing perspective because it's tied to a real date that has an effect. 5-year anniversary of X, 25-year anniversary of X, celebration of this month, etc.
Okay, great. I'm just taking a look here. It looks like we got one more question. And Chris, you can see if folks are still with us or if we should... about
100 people with us, so we'll go for a couple more minutes and then we'll call it for today. And by the way, I will put my email in, and Laura will do the same in the chat bar. And if anyone has any questions on anything we've talked about today, feel free to reach out to either of us.
So it is definitely fortuitous that there's 100 folks left with us, because this question is around a 100th anniversary project. Okay. Mark said that he benefited greatly from access to the original ledger book, which, gosh, that is just such an amazing asset. But he said, but the book was in tatters. It was estimated to repair it at about $1,500. The current leadership didn't want to pay the money. What can someone in this position do to preserve and protect such a valuable asset?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you can tie the celebration to I think if you can tie what the book represents to more than just a celebration of the anniversary, you're going to have greater success. So for example, Nike has done an incredible job in building an archive of every shoe and every design they've ever created. And then they use that archive to help inspire new products and new innovations. And so they don't look at their archive as something that's merely nice to have. They look at it as a source of revenue and critical to the R&D that drives their company. And so, I don't know what this private company does, but I know that if you have been around 100 years, you've been successful. And that is something to be celebrated. But the history and the legacy of the company should also be something that's considered valuable to hiring new employees, joining a culture of a company that's been around 100 years, inspiring new products or that can pull from the heritage and going back 100 years. And so I would argue that you should frame the repair as something that's critical to their marketing and critical to somewhere where they do place a lot of money. And that will help. That's at least my perspective. I know Laura will also have insights.
Yeah, I mean, there really is no substitution for that original. I mean, at this point, it's an original artifact, right? It's really has this value as an artifact. And so that's really important. And, you know, to be honest, there's no substitution for a professional, for a conservator, for example, to make that repair. You know, but one thing that I just kind of thought about, and this is a very technical response, I guess, is to perhaps capture the information that's in there just by taking some digital photographs. To be honest, I'm just concerned about the risk of loss of such a valuable resource. Chris, your ideas are great for converting the leadership team. I think so many times, though, we know that takes some time. And, you know, what can you do that doesn't have a cost associated with it to ensure that at least the information is preserved until you're able to convert the leadership team to see the value and see the ROI on preserving such an important part of your history. So maybe that's kind of an in-between measure until it can actually be properly preserved.
Absolutely. And then Stephanie has a question on what do you say to those who suggest that digital storytelling can replace physical historical assets and real museum experiences? And as somebody that owns a digital storytelling company, I'll tell you, I think that suggestion is a really bad suggestion. Digital storytelling is not a replacement. It is a way to enhance. It is a way to supplement. It is a way to reach new audiences. It's a way to allow them to interact with something. You know, if a asset in your archive, like the book that's being talked about above, is in tatters, or if it is in a condition where the public really can't have access to it, imagine being able to have a 3D image of that book that someone could rotate on a screen, right? It's allowing you to interact with something you physically can experience. But I would never suggest, at least, that digital storytelling is a replacement. It is just merely a way to enhance and activate physical assets in new ways that speaks to a generation that has grown up with technology. But you never know, right? Laura may have a completely disagree with me here.
No, we're in total agreement on that. And, you know, the only other thing I will add is that the digital storytelling can just sort of increase engagement and buy-in from supporters to do really important things like preservation of, you know, the original materials that might need it, you know, garner interest and support from donors financially in order to keep the brick and mortar museums operating, as well as really preserving those really important artifacts.
Absolutely. And also, you know, when we talked about participation earlier, digital storytelling invites your community to become a living part of your collections, and they will forever be tied to your organization when they submit a story, or if and when they submit a story. And that just will make your organization and its collections that much more impactful and true. Laura, when you talked about earlier gaps, one great thing about crowdsourcing as well is that you never know if somebody is going to spot something in the collections that is inaccurate, for example, in the metadata, and be able to help create a more accurate collection and archive. We've seen that happen over and over through crowdsourcing.
Absolutely. I think we may have gotten them all.
I think so. All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone that joined us today. And you will be getting a copy of the recording as soon as it's done through processing. And stay tuned for future webinars. Thanks.
Thank you.